Have you ever stopped to think about the sheer scale of the decisions involved when, say, a massive new mine is proposed? How do these huge undertakings designed to get valuable resources out of the ground actually ripple through our environment, reshape communities, and affect our future? Today, we're diving headfirst into the fascinating and complex world of environmental impact assessment. We're drawing directly from a really comprehensive text, Mining and the Environment, to explore how we actually identify, evaluate, and navigate the consequences of these major industrial developments.
Right. And for you, the listener, our mission is pretty clear. We want to give you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. We'll lay out the structured way experts look at environmental and social changes, how they design ways to lessen the negative effects, and then, crucially, how they monitor if those efforts are actually working. We'll dig into the methodologies, maybe challenge some common assumptions, and definitely acknowledge the inherent uncertainties that always come with assessments like this.
Yeah, get ready for some, I think, surprising facts and key insights. Because this isn't just about rocks and machinery. It's about this incredibly complex dance between huge natural processes and human intervention. And as you'll hear, it involves so many different perspectives when a landscape or maybe a whole community is potentially about to change forever. So to kick things off, let's freaking nail down a fundamental concept. When we talk about an impact in this whole context, what are we really trying to capture? Is it just any change?
That's a great place to start because honestly, even the words we use can be a bit tricky. Often you'll see effect, impact, and change used almost interchangeably, especially early on, without immediately slapping a good or bad label on them. Now, some conventions might say impacts are only the harmful effects or use the word damage for that. But the key first step, it's really just describing the nature of the change itself, objectively if possible.
And here's where it gets really nuanced, I think. A single change can actually be a huge benefit for one group of people, but at the exact same time be completely devastating for others. Have you ever really thought about it in those terms? It makes things so much more complicated, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Think of a new line. It brings jobs, income, sure. But maybe for local farmers, their traditional land is now polluted, or maybe they can't even access it anymore. Suddenly, their whole livelihood vanishes. And another critical factor is the rate of change. A slow, gradual shift might be acceptable. Maybe it even leads to a new, stable environmental state. But rapid, massive fluctuations, those can be completely intolerable for human communities and for ecosystems.
Okay, and that leads us straight into the practical challenges, the real nitty-gritty of environmental assessment. How on earth do you separate out natural changes from the ones caused specifically by a project? How do you account for wildly different value systems? What about working within very real limits on time and money, all while trying to pick the right methods from this huge toolkit of options? It just seems like a monumental task.
Oh, it really is.
Yeah.
And that first challenge you mentioned, distinguishing human impacts from natural variation, that's incredibly tough because the natural environment is never static. It's always changing. We're talking everything from continental drift over millions of years down to floods, tsunamis, or even like rapid shifts in plant communities happening over just a few years. It's a constantly moving target.
Which brings us neatly to a really fascinating case study from our source material, the Karstens Glacier in West Papua. Back when the Freeport mine expansion was being assessed in '97, there was this significant concern that the mining operations would actually speed up the glacier's decline.
And here's the counter perspective that really complicates that direct link. Equatorial glaciers, including Karstens, they've actually been melting for centuries, long before major industrial activity nearby. And that melting has accelerated over the last 30 years or so, mostly due to broader temperature shifts. Many are predicted to be gone by mid-century, unfortunately, regardless of specific local projects. So the real mind-bender is trying to figure out how much, if any, of that decline is due to mining-induced microclimate changes versus this huge natural long-term trend. It just highlights how hard it is to isolate those incremental project impacts, like finding a specific raindrop in a storm.
Wow, and if that wasn't complex enough, let's look at another really compelling example, Eastern Kalimantan in Indonesia. Our source describes this region undergoing just dramatic, completely interwoven changes. We're talking massive logging, huge fires, including these peat swamp fires that, get this, in 1998 alone released an estimated 17% of total worldwide CO2 emissions for that year.
Staggering numbers.
And now, on top of all that, you have these vast oil palm plantations spreading like wildfire. And the irony, as the research points out, is that this big push for renewable biofuels is actually causing widespread environmental damage and contributing to more CO2 emissions in some cases.
It's a truly intricate, tangled picture. And when you throw mining into that mix in Kalimantan, you see these huge coal operations. They bring in billions in export revenue, represent a big chunk of world exports. But here's the surprise. While mining companies working in orangutan territory often get targeted by advocacy groups, and understandably their directly affected areas are actually quite small compared to the vast scale of logging and palm oil. And in a fascinating twist, some mining companies, like PT Cult and Primacol mentioned in the text, have actually rescued orangutans from fires and even cooperated on habitat restoration. It really challenges some simple narratives about who the primary drivers of change always are.
So it really boils down to this, doesn't it? The core difficulty in all these assessments is establishing a reliable baseline. How do you truly know what the environment would have looked like without the project, especially when there are so many other human activities already churning away in the background? It's like trying to hit a constantly moving target.
Exactly. And that question immediately throws us into the whole issue of differing value systems. When we ask, is this change good or bad? The answer can vary dramatically depending on where you are. In many developing nations, the immediate need to tackle widespread poverty, lack of food, shelter, basic health care, that might lead to a greater tolerance for environmental degradation. It's sometimes called the pollution of poverty, which is quite different from the pollution of affluence, often discussed in developed countries. Different priorities, different perspectives.
Right. But this isn't about just saying, oh, accept degradation. Far from it. The widely accepted goal now is definitely to plan mine development so you make the best use of resources without wrecking the environment for future generations. Sustainable development. Though it's interesting how advocacy groups on all sides can sometimes really dig in their heels and emphasize their viewpoints so strongly, it makes finding that balanced discussion pretty challenging.
And beyond values, there's the very practical constraint of resources. We're talking money, time, and the actual expertise available to do these detailed environmental assessments. It's not an unlimited supply.
And just to give you a sense of scale here, an environmental and social impact assessment, the ESIA, typically costs less than 1% of the total project cost. So for big projects, maybe $300,000 to $3 million, somewhere in that range. Now compare that to the engineering feasibility studies, those can be up to 10% of the capital cost. Or the actual mitigation measures needed, which usually run about 3–5% of the total project cost. It puts the ESIA cost in perspective.
It does. So managing those ESIA costs effectively is key. Practical ways to do that. Integrate the assessment really early into the project planning, seek support from the host government, try to involve local expertise, maybe from universities, to avoid relying solely on expensive international specialists, and just leveraging experienced study teams who know how to do this efficiently.
And it's not just money, right? Time is a huge factor. An ISHA for a major mine can take anywhere from 1 to even 3 years sometimes. That timeline gets stretched or shrunk by the project type, the existing environment, how much data you already have, and all the legal hoops you have to jump through, including, importantly, public consultation and getting approvals.
And we also need to be pretty upfront about the challenge of objectivity in impact assessment. Our research source is quite clear. It can never be entirely objective. Just not possible. Biases are expected from all the different stakeholders involved, and limitations, financial, technical, scientific application, they inevitably bring in subjective viewpoints. However, the very presence of opposing viewpoints, sometimes even within the study team itself, that often acts as a check and balance, tending to mitigate against really systemic bias. That's a significant safeguard.
Okay, so given all this complexity, how do the professionals even start to untangle this web? They often begin by categorizing impacts, right? Putting them into different buckets to make sense of it all. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Exactly. Categorization is a tool. So typically, we distinguish a few key types. First, you have direct impacts. These are the environmental changes you can immediately associate with the project activities. Think the obvious things. Changes in the landform, erosion from building stuff, dust kicking up, or maybe altered water quality, right, where effluent is discharged. These are usually reasonably predictable.
Okay, direct impacts. Got it. Then you have indirect impacts. What are those?
Right, so indirect impacts are the environmental changes that aren't directly linked. They often happen further away, maybe through complex chains of events, sometimes called secondary or even third-level impacts. And these are often subtle, really difficult to identify, let alone measure accurately. For instance, a mine might directly change the groundwater level,
Okay.
which then indirectly affects a nearby wetland. Maybe the plants change, the animals dependent on those plants change. It's a knock-on effect.
And what's really crucial, you're saying, and maybe a bit counterintuitive, is that these indirect impacts often outnumber the direct ones and can actually be more significant overall.
That's often the case, yes. It's quite surprising sometimes.
So, like, a small increase in noise might not seem like a big deal directly, but it could have huge indirect ecological impacts, maybe disrupting nesting birds miles away. Or even just the perception of more jobs attracts a lot of people to an area, which then puts immense stress on local schools, roads, housing, leading to really severe negative social impacts that go way beyond the mine fence. That's a ripple effect.
Precisely. A ripple effect is a great way to put it. And then we also have induced impacts. These come from other developments or activities that are encouraged by the original project. If the mine leads to a bigger local population, that might necessitate building better roads to the site. Those new roads are an induced impact. These are often best looked at as part of wider regional development planning.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk cumulative impacts. This sounds like things adding up over time or space.
Exactly. Think of it less like one big hammer blow and more death by 1,000 cuts, or maybe multiple waves hitting the same spot. The source explains how these can build up in different ways. Sometimes it's temporal, a series of impacts, maybe none too bad on their own, just building up over time. The example given is family stress from continuous fly-in, fly-out work schedules. It accumulates. Or it can be accumulative in a different way, where different types of impacts, like air pollution, plus noise, plus traffic, plus visual blight, all pile onto a single receptor, like a community or a specific habitat. Any single one might be tolerable, but the combination is overwhelming.
And this concept of nibbling loss, that sounds insidious.
It is. It's the gradual disturbance and loss of land and habitat, like small bits of land cleared incrementally as a mine expands over years, or a new road slowly alienating wildlife habitat, not just by taking land, but through noise and light disturbance. Piece by tiny piece, it adds up.
Okay, what else falls under cumulative?
There's also spatial and temporal crowding. Basically, too much happening in too small an area or too quickly. Imagine multiple discharge pipes releasing effluent downstream, and their plumes overlap, creating a much bigger zone of impact than any single pipe would.
Got it. Crowding.
And finally, growth-inducing potential. This is where one impact triggers further effects, sometimes called spin-off impacts. A classic example is improved road access to remote areas leading to increased hunting or logging pressure, something not directly caused by the mine, but enabled by it.
And these cumulative effects, they don't just add up simply, right? Sometimes they can amplify each other.
That's a critical point. The magnitude can be purely additive, just the sum of the parts, or it can be synergistic, where the combined effect is actually greater than the sum of the individual parts. The source gives an example. Maybe two different wastewater streams from mineral processing both meet quality standards individually, but when they mix downstream, they react chemically and cause significant pollution. That's synergy.
But it's not all negative accumulation, is it? There must be offsetting effects, too.
Absolutely. You also get canceling, offsetting, or compensating impacts. These are pretty common. Maybe water taken out by the mine is balanced by treated water being discharged. Or increased traffic is offset by the company funding improvements to local roads. In fact, proactively generating these positive offsetting impacts is a key goal of good environmental management. It's about finding balance.
Okay, so we've identified and categorized potential impacts. Now comes the really tricky part. Deciding if an impact is actually significant. How do you even begin to judge that?
Right, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is
Yeah.
it significant? Generally, this evaluation is based on looking at a number of commonly accepted significance attributes. These are like different lenses to view the impact through. Table 10.3 in the source list is quite a few.
Let's walk through some of the key ones. They really help frame the issue. First, there's nature or direction, basically. Is the effect positive, neutral, or negative? And it's crucial to remember, as we said, projects often have both positive and negative effects simultaneously. Creating income for some, sure, but maybe displacing others from their income sources?
Then there's magnitude. How severe is the effect? Is it minor, maybe even inconsequential? Or is it major, even catastrophic? Often the number of people affected is a key criterion here. For instance, the Asian Development Bank guidelines mention that resettlement is considered significant if more than 200 households are displaced. And here's where perception is huge. Small, positive things, like the company funding scholarships, can massively boost positive community feelings, whereas small, maybe technically minor accidents can completely destroy trust and credibility.
Okay, magnitude and perception. What about recovery?
That's reversibility. Can the environment bounce back once the impact happens or stops? Irreversible changes things like species extinction, really severe soil erosion, wiping out ancient rainforest. Those are considered highly significant because they represent a permanent loss of future options. Even something like groundwater pollution, while generally reversible, might take decades or even centuries to fully recover. That lack of quick reversibility adds to its significance.
And how long the effect lasts must be important too.
Definitely, that's duration. Long-term environmental effects are often very significant. Think about waste rock dumps or tailings dams. These are often permanent landscape features, designed to last hundreds, even thousands of years. Open pits permanently do change the landscape too. But interestingly, even short-term effects can be deemed significant, especially if they really sour public perception. Like major community disruption during a short construction phase can cast a long shadow.
And how often it happens? Frequency.
Right. If an activity is intermittent, maybe it allows the environment time to recover in between. Some river ecosystems, for example, might evolve to cope with occasional pulses of muddy water as long as there are clear periods. Continuous impact is often worse than intermittent.
Geographic spread must matter too. Geographic extent.
Absolutely. How far does the effect travel? A really localized adverse effect might not be deemed significant overall, but widespread effects, definitely more significant. Consider, say, one small stream crossing localized impact. But if you have multiple crossings on the same stream system, that can lead to significant downstream water quality degradation affecting fish populations many kilometers away, potentially for months or years. And some places, like Australia, have national laws defining matters of national environmental significance, things like World Heritage Sites or habitats of threatened species, where any significant impact is a major concern, regardless of how localized it might seem initially.
Okay, and finally, how likely is it to happen? Likelihood.
Yes, the probability of an impact occurring, and also the certainty we have about its significance. This is where you get into confidence limits. How sure are we about our prediction? Is it a definite impact or just a possibility?
So we have all these attributes, but you mentioned earlier that ranking significance is still largely subjective.
It really is. While we have these objective approaches and attributes to guide us, ultimately evaluating the significance, deciding if something is minor versus major versus unacceptable. That relies heavily on the professional judgment of experienced people who understand the context. There are scales, like in Table 10.4, ranging from negligible to unacceptable, but applying them involves judgment.
Unacceptable sounds pretty final. What qualifies for that?
Yeah, unacceptable generally applies only to negative impacts. Examples might include a high likelihood of catastrophic failure, like a dam break, potential loss of human life, or impacts on nationally or internationally recognized protected areas or heritage sites. Those are usually red lines.
Okay, so we understand impacts and significance better. Now, how do you choose the method to actually do the assessment? You said there are many.
There are indeed many methodologies. Selecting the right one means thinking about things like, is it acceptable to the regulators and the public? How accurate is it likely to be? Is it relevant to the specific issues? What are the confidence limits? And importantly, is the effort proportional to the potential impact? And it's critical to remember these methodologies are tools, not magic recipes. They aren't cookbooks that guarantee a perfect outcome. They guide the process.
Let's dig into some of these methods then. What are the main ones?
Okay, first up, probably the simplest, checklists. These are basically lists built from past experience, often using that source pathway receptor idea. They act as reminders. Have we thought about noise? Have we thought about water quality? Useful for initial scoping, raising awareness. It's better if they ask open questions like, to what extent, rather than just yes, no. Downsides. They might miss site-specific issues or just be too generic.
Makes sense. What about talking to people? Consultation.
Hugely important. Directly engaging with the people who might be affected. It's particularly useful for defining the scope of the assessment, what really matters to people. Also for identifying impacts they foresee and understanding who feels they'll be impacted. Ideally, this consultation should continue throughout the project's life, though early on, confidentiality can sometimes be an issue. One challenge is collecting what's called soft data, people's perceptions, feelings, attitudes. It's harder to quantify, but you build credibility by being really clear about your objectives and how you're gathering that information.
Okay, checklists, consultation. What about more structured tools? Matrices.
Right, matrices are essentially tables. The famous Leopold matrix is a classic example. They systematically link project activities, like blasting or building roads, with environmental components, like air quality or wildlife. They help visualize where potential impacts might occur, highlight potential cumulative impacts and interactions. You can even add weights or symbols to indicate different significance levels. But, crucially, matrices usually don't quantify the impact significance. You need other methods for that. But they're easy to understand, great visual summaries, especially good for comparing different project alternatives side by side.
And network or flowchart analysis. That sounds like drawing connections.
It is. These trace the links and pathways between causes and effects, and also between different environmental parts. Think of a diagram showing how clearing land leads to erosion, which leads to sediment in rivers, which harms fish. They're really good at identifying those indirect impacts, the knock-on effects, and complex interactions. You can even show feedback loops. A practical tip, though. It's usually better to make several simpler flowcharts focusing on specific pathways, rather than one gigantic, overly complex one that nobody can follow.
Good advice. What about mapping, spatial analysis?
Yes, using overlay mapping, usually with Geographic Information Systems (GIS). This helps identify the geographic extent of impacts. Where will the dust likely settle? Where might different impacts overlap? GIS is like the high-tech version of tracing paper overlays. It lets you build multi-layered electronic maps really quickly, combine all sorts of environmental data, and see spatial patterns. Especially useful for large areas, like the Taiwan bauxite refinery example in the source.
And underpinning all of this is expert opinion, right?
Absolutely. Professional judgment is always going to be a core part of environmental assessment. It's not really a method on its own, but it's indispensable, especially for complex impacts where checklists just don't cut it, like predicting the full range of effects of mine water discharge on a river ecosystem from direct toxicity to subtle shifts in the food web. That takes real biological expertise and judgment.
Which really highlights the need for a diverse team.
Critically important, a multidisciplinary study team. You need mining engineers talking to aquatic biologists, talking to anthropologists, talking to biodiversity specialists. It's the interaction and, frankly, the brainstorming, even having people play devil's advocate among these diverse experts that leads to the most robust and reliable assessment. Challenging each other's assumptions is key.
There's a great anecdote in the source about that, the Bighorn sheep study, near a proposed mine in Idaho and also an existing quarry in Colorado. Initially, everyone assumed the sheep were super sensitive to any human activity. Big concern.
Right.
But then they actually observed the sheep grazing quite contentedly right around an operating crushing plant.
Yeah.
It really drives home that point. Sometimes indirect effects on wildlife are exaggerated. Many species are more adaptable than we assume. You really need to compare potential habitat loss with unaffected areas, not just jump to conclusions. Okay, so we've identified potential impacts using various methods. Now, how do we actually evaluate their significance, especially when dealing with things like pollution levels or physical changes?
Right. For those kinds of physical chemical changes like predicting air pollution concentrations or changes in water flow, we typically turn to quantitative assessment methods, and these often rely heavily on mathematical models.
So these models are like complex calculators. You put in data about emissions, say, and they predict the pollution level somewhere else. The source mentions simple ones like the Gaussian plume model for air or the universal soil loss equation are quite common, maybe more so than super complex ones because they need less data and expertise.
Exactly. They try to approximate how things move through the environment: air, water, soil. Input emission rates, get predicted concentrations at a receptor point. But, and this is a huge but, it's the classic garbage in, garbage out problem. The accuracy of the model's prediction depends entirely on the accuracy of the input data. And getting accurate input data for complex, naturally variable systems is often really difficult and expensive. Natural background levels fluctuate constantly. That's why processes like calibration, checking the model against real-world measurements, and validation, testing it against new data, are so vital. And sensitivity analysis helps figure out which input parameters have the biggest effect on the outcome, showing where the uncertainties lie.
And for tackling uncertainty directly, there's something called Monte Carlo analysis.
Yes, that's a more advanced probabilistic approach.
Yeah.
Instead of single input values, you use ranges or probability distributions for your inputs. The model runs thousands of times with randomly generated inputs from those distributions. The output isn't a single number, but a range of likely outcomes, with probabilities attached, mean, standard deviation, confidence limits. It gives a much better picture of the uncertainty involved.
But these mathematical models, they work best for physical stuff like pollution, less so for biology or people.
Generally, yes, they're best suited for physical chemical changes. Predicting how an entire ecosystem or a human community will respond is vastly more complex and often beyond the reliable capabilities of purely mathematical models.
So what other specialized tools are there? The source mentions a few. Ecological modeling.
Right. These models try to represent the key processes within natural ecosystems like population dynamics or nutrient cycling. They can be useful for looking at cumulative effects on species or habitats and trying to differentiate between simple additive effects and more complex interactive ones.
And visual modeling. That sounds like making pictures.
Pretty much. Creating photo montages, putting a realistic image of the proposed mine onto photos of the existing landscape. It helps assess the visual impact, how much it changes the view, but the assessment itself, deciding if the change is acceptable, remains subjective, not really numerical.
Okay. And threshold analysis.
This is based on the idea that many environmental systems have thresholds, critical limits that shouldn't be crossed, like maximum safe pollutant concentrations in water or minimum required levels of dissolved oxygen for fish. It's often used to compare the project's predicted emissions or impacts against established regulatory standards or ecological thresholds. Are we likely to exceed a critical limit?
But what if you can't use these quantitative methods? Too complex, not enough data or money.
Then you rely on a less formal qualitative assessment. This leans heavily on expert advice, experience from similar past projects, scientific literature, maybe conceptual models that show relationships without precise numbers. It often involves getting a group of experts together, discussing the potential impacts, and trying to reach a consensus based on their collective knowledge and judgment. It's about informed reasoning when hard numbers aren't available or reliable.
Let's shift focus slightly to something incredibly sensitive. Cultural heritage sites. How are these handled? They're not just environmental components.
No, they're definitely not. Cultural heritage sites are defined as human works or places holding spiritual, cultural, or historical value. The assessment faces three big challenges here. 1, defining what actually constitutes a cultural site. 2, deciding how significant it is. And 3, trying to objectively judge the project's potential impact on it. Thankfully, relevant laws and guidelines, both local and international, usually provide a framework for answering these questions, but it's still a very nuanced area.
And the range is huge. The source lists things like Aboriginal cultural landscapes, archaeological digs, historic districts, places linked to important people, cemeteries, even old engineering structures.
Exactly. It's incredibly broad. And what's particularly difficult is evaluating impacts on sites of purely spiritual significance, partly because their meaning isn't easily grasped by outsiders, and partly because there are often cultural protocols, secrecy, or taboos around them. So really close, respectful consultation with the affected cultural groups is absolutely essential here. You can't assess it from the outside.
Okay, moving from specific sites to the broader picture, community impacts. The source calls these special. What makes them different?
They're special because they cover such a wide range of human experience. Social impacts like relocation or changes in population structure, economic impacts like jobs, income, land ownership changes, effects on existing land use and future growth patterns, and impacts on public services, schools, healthcare, police. It's the whole fabric of community life.
And assessing these sounds even harder than the physical stuff.
It often is. There's a real lack of rigorous quantitative methods for many community impacts. Few clear thresholds or standards like you have for, say, air pollution. So the significance of community impacts is very often determined by professional judgment on a case-by-case basis. And again, you're dealing heavily with that soft data of people's perceptions, feelings, attitudes. It makes acceptance trickier, but explaining your methods clearly helps build credibility.
Let's dive into a few specific community impacts mentioned as important. Growth inducement, the mine attracting people, and development.
Right. This is arguably one of the biggest consequences of many mining projects. This induced growth, this boomtown effect, can be positive new businesses, more housing, or negative straining infrastructure, creating social problems. It's often unplanned, hard to predict, difficult to manage. It can put immense pressure on local government, potentially leading to slums, poor sanitation, health risks, maybe increased crime if not handled well. These secondary induced effects can easily become more significant than the direct impacts of the mine itself.
What about community cohesion, that feeling of belonging?
That can take a real hit, especially during the construction phase, when you often get a large influx of temporary workers, outsiders who may not share the local values or have a long-term stake in the community. It can disrupt existing social networks and that sense of shared identity, making the community feel less cohesive.
And probably the most sensitive of all, relocation or displacement, moving people out of their homes or off their land.
Definitely among the most sensitive. There are three aspects to consider. First, just the sheer number and type of people or businesses being displaced. Second, is there suitable comparable land or housing available for them to move to? And third, the profound psychological and economic impacts. Being forced to move is deeply disruptive. Financial compensation often doesn't fully cover the loss, especially for rural or indigenous communities with deep cultural ties to specific land. Now, while it's usually seen as negative, the source does acknowledge that sometimes people can end up with better housing or conditions, but even that can cause problems, like jealousy or social tension if the compensation seems unfair or disproportionate to others.
So how do you prioritize which community impacts to focus on? You can't study everything in infinite detail.
No, you can't. Generally, impacts that seriously affect large numbers of people for a long time, like having to relocate an entire village, obviously get higher priority. However, sometimes advocacy groups can shift the focus. They might raise concerns about a perceived impact that isn't actually likely to occur, forcing the project team to spend valuable resources proving a negative rather than focusing on managing more tangible, real issues. Priorities can get distorted.
This discussion of fairness and vulnerable groups naturally leads to environmental justice. What does that mean in this context?
Environmental justice is about the fair treatment of all people, regardless of race, culture, income, when it comes to environmental laws, regulations, and policies. In mining, it means socioeconomic studies must identify any ethnic minorities, racial minorities, or low-income groups within the affected communities, and then critically address any potential for disproportionately high and adverse health or environmental effects on those specific groups. International standards, like the Equator Principles used by many banks, explicitly require this focus on mitigating impacts on vulnerable groups.
And achieving that relies heavily on communication.
Absolutely. Promoting environmental justice requires continuous communication and genuine participation, engaging with both formal and informal community leaders through ongoing outreach, actively seeking out, and importantly, heeding the opinions of all affected people, especially those who might normally be less likely to speak up. It's about ensuring everyone has a voice and is heard.
This links directly to group decision-making and environmental assessment, doesn't it? Moving beyond just scientists in a lab.
Exactly. It's recognizing that assessment isn't just a technical exercise done in isolation. It's a dynamic, iterative process.
Oh.
It involves social interactions between the assessors, the project engineers, the various stakeholders, the scientists, and the people who will ultimately use the assessment, like government regulators.
The source uses a great visual, participation along the spectrum, showing everyone involved from local folks right up to international NGOs and government agencies. And it highlights that fundamental difference in perspective. The scientist might ask, how can I make my prediction more accurate? But the regulator or community member asks, okay, what can we actually do about this, given our real-world constraints? Group decision-making tries to bridge that gap.
Right. And there are widely accepted benefits to these interactive discussions, especially for things like ranking the significance of impacts, particularly social ones, and deciding on mitigation priorities. Bringing different perspectives together, weighing importance based on collective experience, it generally leads to more robust and socially acceptable outcomes.
How does this work in practice? Workshops.
Workshops are a common tool. You bring stakeholders together to discuss potential impacts, debate their significance, and collaboratively develop mitigation and monitoring plans. Now, they have challenges. You might get dominant personalities taking over, or people holding back due to personal biases, or even cultural norms in some places that discourage open disagreement. Using multiple workshops, maybe with different groups, can help mitigate some of that.
And there's a more formal technique mentioned, the Delphi technique.
Yes, developed by the RAND Corporation. It's designed to help a group reach consensus, especially when dealing with politically charged or emotional issues without the pitfalls of face-to-face debate. Basically, you get a panel of carefully chosen experts. They answer a series of questions independently and anonymously. The facilitator summarizes the anonymous responses and feeds them back to the panel for the next round. Over several rounds, the responses tend to converge towards a consensus, avoiding issues like bandwagoning or pressure to conform. It's a structured way to tap collective expertise anonymously.
Okay, so we have all these methods, attempts at objectivity, group processes. But you keep coming back to the idea that assessment can never be entirely objective.
It's a core reality we have to accept.
Yeah.
Despite everyone's best intentions, some bias is almost inevitable. And those practical constraints, money, time, data gaps, scientific uncertainty, They force subjective judgment. It's just inherent in the process.
Which raises questions about the study team itself. Mining companies often hire external environmental consultants for efficiency, specialized skills, but doesn't that raise public concerns about potential bias? If the company's paying the consultant, are they really independent?
That's a common perception and a fair question to ask. However, the source argues that, in practice, true conflicts of interest leading to biased reports are relatively rare these days. Why? Mainly because the whole environmental assessment process is so much more transparent now. There's public scrutiny, regulatory oversight. Plus, increasingly, the interests of everyone involved, the company, the consultants, the regulators, are actually aligned towards achieving a positive outcome, avoiding serious environmental problems, delivering sustainable benefits. That's good for everyone's reputation and bottom line. A major environmental disaster reflects badly on everyone.
So what mechanisms help ensure this objectivity or at least transparency?
Several regulatory instruments help. Mandatory public consultation and public hearings are probably the most direct way to get objective feedback from affected communities. It's their chance to voice concerns and suggestions directly to the company and the government. Of course, hearings can have their own issues. Sometimes individuals try to disrupt them, or advocacy groups might use them as a platform for broader agendas rather than specific project concerns, but they're still a vital check.
What else?
Government review committees. These bring together representatives from different government departments, maybe independent scientific experts, community members. They provide an informed, multi-agency review of the assessment and the key issues. They've worked well in some places. Developing countries sometimes bring in foreign experts to assist these committees too.
And the role of banks. Independent review by financial institutions.
Yeah, while not strictly regulatory, this is often a very powerful influence. Major banks, especially those following standards like the Equator Principles, often commission their own independent experts to review the project's ESI. If that review finds shortcomings, the bank can demand additional studies or stronger mitigation measures before they agree to provide funding. That financial leverage is a significant driver for companies to do a thorough, objective job.
Now, thinking about the methods themselves and objectivity, you mentioned quantitative methods are often preferred.
Yes, because in theory, they're more precise and reproducible. They deal with numbers, not just opinions. Their outcomes can often be directly compared to numerical standards like parts per million for a pollutant. This makes it easier to see if you're meeting legal limits, and it can make the trade-offs clearer. How much does it cost to reduce this impact by X amount? It facilitates clearer comparisons.
But quantitative methods have limitations too, right? It's not a silver bullet.
Absolutely not. There are significant limitations. First, they can require a disproportionate amount of effort in data collection and modeling. Sometimes, just applying experienced expert judgment might be more efficient and just as effective, even if it feels more subjective. The source gives an interesting example with acid rock drainage predictions sometimes. Despite hundreds of costly tests, the predictions were way off. Maybe simpler, more conservative assumptions would have been better in those cases.
And the data itself can be flawed.
The garbage in, garbage out problem again. Incomplete or inaccurate input data. Natural systems are highly variable. Collecting enough data over long enough periods to truly capture averages and extremes is often difficult, sometimes practically impossible within project timelines and budgets.
Plus, the models themselves aren't perfect.
No, model limitations are real. While some things like noise propagation or basic air dispersion are fairly well understood scientifically, modeling complex ecosystems, how they'll react to multiple stressors, that's incredibly difficult and fraught with uncertainty. The assessment must clearly state these limitations and uncertainties.
And sometimes standards themselves are an issue.
Right. You might have conflicting standards, or local standards might be outdated, non-existent, or maybe just not appropriate for this specific situation. Referring to established international standards can be helpful then.
And finally, just presenting numbers can be misleading.
Yes, the illusion of certainty. Fancy graphs and complex models can sometimes suggest a level of precision that just isn't justified by the underlying data or assumptions. It's crucial to avoid this. Being transparent about limitations, assumptions, and uncertainties doesn't weaken the assessment counterintuitively. It actually strengthens its credibility. People trust honesty about what isn't known.
So after all this assessment, we're still left dealing with uncertainties and risks. They seem unavoidable.
They are. A degree of uncertainty is inherent in all impact prediction.
Yeah.
You're relying on judgment, on historical data that might not repeat, on sampling tiny bits of rock or soil to represent huge areas, and on the simple fact that accidents do happen. Tailings dam failures, road accidents, chemical spills, fires. These go wrong despite best efforts.
Okay, let's be precise with terms here, as the source is. An impact is the change caused by the project. A hazard is something that could lead to negative impacts, like the poor quality of untreated mine water or a major storm event. And risk.
Risk is the combination of two things: the probability or likelihood of a specific hazard actually occurring, and the magnitude or severity of the consequences if it does occur. It's likelihood times consequence.
And there's a risk assessment matrix to visualize this?
Yes, Figure 10.14 shows it. It plots likelihood against severity. Obviously, as both probability and severity go up, the risk becomes less acceptable. The whole goal of environmental management, then, is to push risks towards the lower left corner of that matrix. Either eliminate the hazard completely, or reduce the probability of it happening, or reduce the severity of the consequences to an acceptable level. Figure 10.15 illustrates this shift.
But what is an acceptable level of risk? Who decides that?
Risk acceptability. That's incredibly complex and influenced by many factors. First, there are legal limits. Does it meet statutory and policy requirements? Then there's the universal baseline. Zero tolerance for predicted loss of life, even though designing for 100% safety against every conceivable event is impossible. Beyond that, you get into subjective value judgments. What level of harm to an ecosystem is considered unacceptable? That varies hugely. Economic considerations played a role: the cost of reducing risk further versus the potential financial consequences of an incident or project delays. And finally, the complex social aspects, individual perceptions of risk, cultural values, levels of trust or distrust in the company and regulators, the company's credibility, all shape what society deems acceptable.
And for big companies, reputation risk is massive, isn't it?
Huge. Case 10.7, Lafayette's Rapu-Rapu mine in the Philippines, is a stark example. Relatively minor tailings spills, but coming after other industry incidents, they caused severe reputation damage, contributed to the project's bankruptcy, and made it harder for other mining projects, even unrelated ones, to get approvals elsewhere. The reputational fallout can be global and long-lasting.
Wrapping up, how do we practically deal with all this inherent uncertainty and risk?
The source suggests some practical rules of thumb. First, adopt the precautionary principle. When in doubt, make conservative assumptions. Assume potentially more adverse effects just to be safe. Don't gamble on optimism. Second, provide a clear audit trail. Document all your assumptions, data gaps, and the reasoning behind your conclusions so others can understand how you got there. Third, obviously, recommend concrete mitigation and monitoring measures to reduce the risks and track effectiveness. And fourth, crucially, implement mechanisms to actually evaluate the monitoring results and feed that information back to modify the project or its management if needed. Adaptive management. The source also mentions the Appel for Mining Handbook as a good framework for developing emergency response plans for potential accidents, listing things like tailings, dam failures, and their effects. Be prepared.
Wow, we have covered an incredible amount of ground today, from just defining impact all the way through complex methodologies, human values, objectivity challenges, and finally, risk. Our mission was to get you, the listener, well-informed, quickly and thoroughly on this, and I really feel we've pulled back the curtain on just how intricate and vital environmental impact assessment truly is.
Indeed, and it really underscores that environmental assessment and management isn't a static checklist. It's a dynamic, constantly evolving field. Continuous learning, critical thinking, and especially those collaborative discussions we talked about, they're absolutely paramount if we're going to navigate the challenges of sustainable development successfully. It's definitely an ongoing conversation.
So here's a final thought for you to maybe mull over, building on everything we've discussed. Given how subjective assessing significance can be, especially for cultural and community values, and given the limits of prediction, how much responsibility truly falls on a project developer to foresee and address every single potential unquantifiable ripple effect versus perhaps the responsibility of societies and governments to be much clearer upfront about their non-negotiable thresholds, their core values, the lines that simply cannot be crossed? Where does that balance lie? Something to consider as you reflect on today's deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration.